So who are you?
So I'm Brian Deere, and I'm organizer of a conference at the Computer History Museum this June 2nd and 3rd called the PLATO at 50 conference, and it's celebrating the 50th anniversary of the PLATO system, which is, I would argue, among many other things, the birthplace of social media. And that, in a nutshell, is a rather provocative statement, for a lot of folks who are like, experts or pundits in social media, and they go, I've never heard of it. Well, that may be the case, but it is the case that, come to the conference and find out. I've assembled together with a crew at the Computer History Museum and folks from the University of Illinois who were PLATO people back in the 70s and even earlier, who, got his start in computing as a student at the University of Illinois on the PLATO system, and used PLATO Notes, which was the conferencing system, and then went off 10 years later and did Lotus Notes, which you might have heard of, which was very much inspired by the sort of online collaborative culture that he had seen on PLATO and wasn't seeing with the PC revolution, and thought, gosh,
What is PLATO?
So PLATO is, first of all, it's an acronym. PLATO stands for a really wonderful, defense contractor kind of thing. It stands for Programmed Logic for Automated Teaching Operations, and it was funded by ARPA, NSF, DoD, Office of Education, the Johnson administration, Nixon administration. Basically the same money that poured into ARPANET poured into PLATO. And what's, I recently fired off an email to, on a mailing list, the Internet History mailing list, where Vince Cerf and a bunch of the original ARPANET people hang out. And they talk about, who did Telnet and, RFC stuff and all that. And I asked them, okay, so during like the period 72 to 82, what was the general population, as it were, the census of ARPANET, the early internet? Because my hunch is that PLATO was way bigger. And what was interesting is that, they have records. They have record books of not only, counts of people, but who the individuals were. The community was still roughly about 10,000, and, probably 75 or so. It was way less than that. It grew quickly, And
these are probably mostly people working at research labs.
Exactly. It was a pretty closed kind of thing. Whereas on PLATO, it was far more open. This was a system that the mission of PLATO was education. But what's really phenomenal about it is that the sort of the early hacker culture that discovered this incredible system, starting around 1972, discovered, this was the greatest thing since air to build social software. They didn't call it that at the time. They didn't know. I mean, they were literally building the precursors to instant messaging. The first multi-user chat room was called Talkomatic, which was a huge hit circa 1973. And, just to give you an example, I mean, what's been fascinating, I'm writing a book on the history of PLATO as well as doing this conference, and just discovering that the phenomena that we've all read about in the newspapers and online over the last 10 years, about, say, people entering a chat room and adopting a false identity, or if you're a guy, appearing as a girl just as a joke and fooling everybody and everything. Every one of those kind of incidents happened in Talkomatic in 1973 and forward. And over and over and over again, when you look at the early examples of the apps that were on PLATO, you see the same social behaviors that we've all read about, been shocked about, laughed about, whatever, all these years later. And it's another classic example is starting around 78, 79, there was a virtual economy of virtual goods that people would pay real cash, sometimes like, $100 or $200 for spells and gold and weapons and, a better user level in Moria or Avatar, one of the great games on PLATO. Another whole dimension to Plato, which we're going to be talking about. One of the things we're talking about at the conference is games. And one of the co-authors of Avatar, this is 30, 40 years before the movie came out, but we'll be there. And Bruce, the guy from Sublogic who did Microsoft Flight Simulator, Bruce Artwick, it will be on the panel. He didn't write for Plato, but Flight Simulator was inspired by Airfight, which was another killer game on Plato, written by Brand Fortner, and Brand is on the panel as well.
If you saw the early flight simulators, I visited with a team when I worked with it at Microsoft. If you play with the early ones, it looks nothing like today.
Oh no!
Just barely a few lines on the screen.
Oh yeah, but see, and Will Wright, the author of SimCity and stuff like that, and Spore more recently, has often talked about this in lectures where one of the and he was talking about it from a standpoint of early computer games and mostly video games, but it's the same is true with Plato. In the 70s, animation was measured in seconds per frame, not frames per second, first of all. So, you couldn't count on, you were not going to get anything close to photorealism. You didn't have color, and on Plato it was monochrome, most typically in orange pixels on a black background, which was a, gas plasma flat panel display, 512 by 512 graphics, which was higher res than the original Macintosh, actually. Nevertheless, the notion of imagination versus technology and the limits of technology, you placed a lot, as a game player, you would place a lot more emphasis, whether you knew it or not, on imagination. And that made the game as incredibly vivid as if you were in a first-person shooter playing on a Wii or a PlayStation now. It didn't matter, and games like Empire, people would play for 10, 12, 24 hours straight on through, in a frantic, fast-paced game that, you look at it now and it kind of looks quaint, but it was nothing but. I mean, you could rip a keyboard apart by pounding at it for literal, one of the great things about Plato is it was designed for education, so everything was designed to deliver, courseware and that kind of stuff, teach students everything from elementary math to advanced physics.
Yeah.
But one of the core principles of the designers of Plato was keep the thing fast and responsive at the keyboard. So if you typed ABC, those characters went all the way out over the phone lines to the cyber mainframe and back to you in less than a tenth of a second, or minimum tenth of a second. That was
were you on the system? Or?
I started using Plato at the University of Delaware in 1979, and
is that what got you into it?
I had used some micros. We had a Wang 2200A at my high school in the 70s, but when I saw Plato, I was just astonished. I had no idea. My experience up to then had been, you use a computer to crunch numbers. It's not that really compelling. You can, maybe games and stuff like that, but you get on Plato and suddenly you realize you are you belong to a community. It was my first experience with basically a really rich social scene on a computer, and Plato really is the first classic example of an online community. There's been a lot of talk lately
what
about
what happened to it? Because
first of all, those gas plasma displays cost $5,000. So the terminals cost $5,000. Control Data Corporation marketed Plato, but if you wanted to buy a Plato system and you were like a corporation or a university, it might set you back $10 million. And then several million per year for the licenses to use the software and the courseware and everything. So it was immensely expensive. And remember, AT&T controlled the telecommunications back then, so you paid Ma Bell pretty high fees for every phone line. So it was a very, very expensive proposition, and then suddenly Apple IIs and Commodores and PCs are coming out all over the place.
That's why I missed it, because that's when I came into the world, right? I was in
Right.
junior high when the Apple II came out.
Right, and I just remember when the Apple II came out, and then the Apple III, and the Lisa, and the Mac, and all that, and the IBM PC, and I was thinking, gosh, these things are just so... They're islands where everyone is on their own desert island. They're not interconnected. Sure, you could now do spreadsheets, and there was early word processing and some games and stuff, or you could sit there and write BASIC or something. But compared to, the PLATO experience, which was 25, 30 years ahead of everybody, and where you would get online and you ask questions, help people, get help from people, just like you do nowadays, completely naturally. That's the way PLATO was. It was exactly what we have now. And however, it was so early. It was so expensive that it was very, very limited to certain markets and certain institutions, and it could not compete with the micros.
Yeah.
And also, Control Data was very reluctant to move away from its very formerly profitable mainframe business. And so even well into the 1980s, they were trying to sell mainframes. And, if you wanted PLATO, please buy a mainframe system. And, that just did not, with the rate of and the scale of the PC revolution, and then the net that was coming after it, there really wasn't any way to compete with that. One thing I might add, though, is at the conference, we're going to have about a dozen fully restored original PLATO terminals connected to essentially a fully functioning replica of a PLATO system with all the games and the courseware and everything from the University of Illinois circa mid-70s.
Wow.
And the system, actually that system's been up since 74, and I was just on it last night, and there were a whole bunch of people playing Empire, which is Empire, by the way, is the great legendary Star Trek inspired space war game. 30 simultaneous users, and there really wouldn't have been anything like it until probably the 90s.
Yeah. It's really crazy. So what day is the conference?
Conference is June 2nd and 3rd. The way we're doing it is around 6 p.m. there'll be a reception and cocktails and everything, and then I'm going to give a talk. The CEO of the Computer History Museum is going to give a little talk, and then Ray Ozzie and Don Bitzer, Don being the founder of PLATO, are going to get up on stage and have a conversation that's moderated by John Markoff of the New York Times.
Yeah.
And that should be a lot of fun. On the one hand, you have Don, who's now 76 and just a brilliant, an engineer's engineer. He's won every distinguished award you can possibly win, except for the Nobel of Engineering, which I don't think they have. But he won an Emmy Award in 2002 for the gas plasma display, which and even the newspapers were going in 1967. Gosh, this is the future of television. And he's like, no. We're building this for education. And he was proven wrong, and he laughs about it now. But and there will be several other people on the hardware panel talking about how PLATO terminals had these flat panel displays, which inspired Alan Kay, by the way, with the Dynabook. He saw a prototype of the PLATO display.
It's now the iPad, basically, right?
It's funny how it all comes. I think Apple has spent the last 30 years trying to trying to make Alan Kay happy. Is this worthy of anyway?
So why should the Facebook generation care about history of something that doesn't matter to today's world? It seems like.
Well, I think for one reason is first of all, there were an awful lot of lessons learned back in that era with that system, and many of the things that happened on PLATO have happened on the net. I think there are still some issues that we saw on PLATO that are playing themselves out now. I don't know. I think one thing that it has become so easy to do a startup now. You talk about it all the time. I lived the startup life too, and we've both seen in the last 5-10 years how you basically don't need anything anymore. And in fact, you don't really need venture capital money. I mean, a little angel money is really all you need to get started. And the VCs will be the first ones to tell you that.
Yeah.
And you've got the cloud. You don't need offices. You can be virtual. So a lot of people, including young people, are doing startups. But one of the things is that when you dive into these things, these new ventures, and you don't have any context or understanding of the lessons that have been learned for many years in a lot of this area, what works, what doesn't work. One of the things that we learned really early on PLATO, we had kind of the luxury of not having scale, the scale that we've seen with the internet. Now that we're at scale, some things don't work as well as they would have worked on PLATO. Arguably, Facebook, is 400 million users, but it's not 400 million users all interacting with each other.
Right.
It's 400 million users off on little islands and little networks of their own, the famous social graph. PLATO was a social graph. It was, one node and everyone was connected to it. And so that was a little different. But just the fact that so much of what we take for granted, in everything from computer games to social software to conferencing systems, originates from PLATO.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of really good thinking about user experience and user interface design back in those days, principles that still stand today and that we keep violating, in this rush for realism, I would argue, realism for realism's sake. You see it on the iPad, for example, with the iBook, you turn the page and it turns with you and all that stuff, which is, cool and everything, but do we really need that? It's a whole other discussion we could have, but there are a lot of interesting lessons learned, and we'll be going into them in depth at the conference. The panels range from talking about how PLATO was used as an educational system versus what we see in education today. And what's really interesting there is there were amazing insights and developments on PLATO that have never been replicated since.
Like what?
Well, for example, you hear about, you probably have seen this. You go to iTunes, for example, and you can go to their online courseware, free courseware, MIT, and what they basically are videos of professors giving lectures. Yeah. Now, that's a wonderful resource, don't get me wrong. I think it's incredible, and I wish I had more time to spend, soaking that stuff up. But they're just videos. Yeah. It's a completely passive medium. It's very easy to distribute and everything. There was a lot of hard work that went into real interactive lessons on PLATO, where it was designed for very individualized instruction, so it would know how well you are doing, and it would remember you the next time you sat down and used it, whatever terminal you might be at, and it would evaluate you, grade you, and all that kind of stuff. You would know how well what your progress is, and that would be fed to the teacher and all that stuff, and it was part of your grade and all that. You don't get that by just sitting down and watching a video. You either watch it or you don't. But there's no interaction. It's a lot harder to do interaction. And, National Science Foundation spent millions of dollars with the University of Illinois to develop, whole curricula, incredible, for example, math and reading lessons for kids, many of which, a lot of those lessons are still in use today. Yeah. The PLATO system actually never really died. It's just broke off in lots of different interesting ways. But there is a system called Novanet, for example, which basically is still the PLATO system from the University of Illinois, and it's still up and running. It typically has, I think, 10 to 13,000 simultaneous users on during the day, and hundreds of thousands of students around the country use that system, mostly for remedial education, in a high school level and that kind of thing. It's all, so it's still happening, but a lot of the stuff that you see nowadays, even if it looks slicker and is high resolution and all that stuff, doesn't have the thinking and the hard work that went into a lot of the work that was done on Plato 40 years ago.
Yeah, you're streaming this conference?
Well, we're going to have a camera crew, an HD crew that's going to be, worst case, recording the whole thing for later streaming, but I'm planning to get Ustream up and running, and I'm looking into that this week. It's one of the reasons I'm up in the area to meet with the museum and talk about Ustream. So yeah, I mean, you can't get better than free. It's a free conference too. So
it's a free conference.
It's a totally free conference. I mean, how many tech conferences have you been to that are totally free?
Not too many.
It would not happen without Microsoft support. Ray Ozzie is a huge supporter of Plato, and and Plato Learning is another company that's a sponsor. I mean, they're the ones who've made it happen. When it comes to a free conference, and I've never done a conference before, but sponsors, gosh, they really are important. Now I understand why they spend time thanking the sponsors at the beginning of the opening session of the conference, because oftentimes it's why everyone's there. They may not realize it, but so that ought to be fun. But so basically,
where can I learn more about the conference?
Go to platohistory.org or go to the computerhistory.org website to get to register. There's a calendar of events on the computerhistory.org site, and that's where you can actually register. It's free. They just want to know how many lunches to make and that kind of thing. But and the Plato History site that I run is a combination of blog and information about the conference, and over time it's going to be a repository for archive material like videos and documents and interview transcripts. I've interviewed about 500 people over the last too many decades for the book I'm writing, and so a lot of info about the book's going to be on that site too.
Very cool. Well, I'm looking forward to the book and the conference. So.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.